This is a session, Working Class and the Movement Today. We've got some three great speakers lined up. And really, it's going to be a discussion about what the working class is in the 21st century, what it means to us, how relevant it is in modern day. And it's a question that comes up quite often. I think just an interesting little anecdote before we start off is people, an argument you quite often hear is Marxism relevant because the working class is gone and all this sort of stuff. Interestingly, the working class of Indonesia today is larger than the working class of the world when Marx was writing. So, just thought I'd put that in there before we started off the discussion. The format we're going to go with is speakers going to have about 10 minutes to start off with. We're then going to welcome contributions, discussions, points, questions, stuff like that from the floor, have a bit of a discussion, and then I'm going to ask the speakers to sum up at the end for about 5 minutes each. First off, we've got Dr. Gibson, the chair of the National Pensioners Convention, lifelong socialist activist, and in my opinion, one of the best speakers on the 26th as well. So, Doc.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I suppose it's true to say that I've been invited to speak today mainly because I'm the Secretary of the National Pensioners Convention, and in that sense involved on a day-to-day basis in struggles on the cuts in a very big way, because the effect of those cuts on pensioners is huge, and it's a death question for many pensioners. It isn't just a question of poverty, it is a question of people's lives that are at stake, and the phone calls that come into the National Pensioners Convention office are now, on a daily basis, are now dealing with those issues. But I wouldn't be active in the National Pensioners Convention or to have considered taking a role in such a movement if it hadn't been for being a Marxist and being one that has gone through the struggle in a particular group, the Socialist Labour League and then the Workers' Revolutionary Party, and gone through a split in that group, the destruction of that group actually, and coming out on the basis of Marxists taking responsibility for the working class as a whole, and not just their own party, and looking outwards to the working class and saying, here we are, come and join us, that we have a responsibility. And it's on that I want to speak today. It'll be a sort of broad brush, because I'm not going to talk particularly about a particular trade union and so on. I became political at a young age of 10, which is what's happening to a lot of kids at school today because of the cuts. But that was at the end of the Second World War, when a mass movement came forward and said we're not going back to the 1930s of unemployment and poverty with no health service and so on. And millions of people came back from the war and joined the others who were already here in this country and also happening all over Europe, and said, put their foot down to the ruling class and said, we're not going back to that. And it was necessary at that time to do the opposite of what they say they're doing today. They had to run over to the United States and get a loan in order to put through the welfare state legislation and the National Health Service in order to allay that movement, which was on the verge of a revolutionary movement all over Europe. There were people who had guns in their hands who'd been in the underground movement, and there were soldiers going back home with that knowledge of how to use firearms and saying that they were prepared to fight on all these issues. So it was at that point that I became political, if you like, and we've seen all sorts of developments since then. But the reason I've come to this meeting and accepted the invitation to take part in this discussion is because I think that this meeting and Counterfire itself arises from a very positive turn by Marxists towards their rightful place. And I think that's what we have to discuss. Whether everybody in this room is a Marxist or not, the fact is that it is Marxists who have promoted Counterfire and have also been through many, many struggles in relation to the development of Marxism. I don't want to use the word left. I know we say the left movement. I'm talking about Marxism and its relationship to the class. So I believe that we're at a very important and exciting coming together of Marxists, and we're leaving behind that destructive method of separating communists from the working class to form our own parties, paying lip service to the movement of the working class itself. And I was very encouraged by what Chris said today in the opening of this event, because I mean, that was something that I had hoped would happen, and I think that we can now say very definitely that the SWP and the breakup of the SWP is leading in a very positive way to Marxists regaining their rightful place in history. So what is the working class, and does it exist today as it did at the time of the Communist Manifesto in 1848? That's the position that our chair opened the meeting with, that at that time it was a very small working class, but mainly dominated, of course, by the British working class, which was the first industrial country. So we have to say, does that working class exist? Many people, as our chair said, tell us that it's not true today, that you don't have the working class in its old form. So I want to just sort of, outline, and it might be very sort of stuff that everybody knows here, but I'm going to just say it anyway. That in capitalist social relations of production, the working class it's contradictory. It is both part of the productive forces, that part which produces surplus value, profit, and it is the exploited class. So it has that dual place in society. And because of this place in capitalist social relations, the working class stands in constant opposition to its capitalist exploiters. So the working class is at one and the same time the exploited and the revolutionary class. And I think it's very important that we understand that dual nature. The working class organises to protect itself and becomes a class for itself with its trade unions and its political parties. And that isn't straightforward, as we all know, because we've seen what Labour does and we've seen what social democracy has done all over the world. I'll come to that. In the Communist Manifesto of 1848, Marx and Engels pointed to the development of imperialism. I think it's also very important to understand that, because without their understanding, without scientific socialism, without the philosophy that they fought for, it would not have been possible to understand that we would be reaching the period that we're now discussing, imperialism in the stage that it has reached, when they, in 1848, said modern industry has established the world market. And I think that this is an understanding that only Marxists could have at that time. And it was in 1864 that the first Workers' International established the necessity of the working class to organise across the world. And I don't think we should take that for granted either, because it's quite possible, and it happens in all of our movements, to start with today and here and now and Britain or France or wherever, and not to understand the movement of the class and the movement of imperialism, and the fact that these two things, that we have to understand this as the necessity to build the international. In the inaugural address of the International Working Men's Association, which was the name of the first international when it was started, Marx showed, one, how poverty accompanies capitalist expansion, and at the last session that I was in was retelling this in terms of the current crisis. He also pointed out what gains the working class has achieved through its own organisation and struggle, and I think this is also very important to point out today, because it's not the same as it was in 1945, and here I sort of perhaps go off slightly. In 1945 there was a huge struggle with the British Medical Association over bringing in the National Health Service, and their compromises were made. But today we see the British Medical Association coming out against the privatisation of the National Health Service. Now that was gained as a result of that big movement of workers demanding that they didn't go back to the 1930s, and the actual experience of the National Health Service has led to the British Medical Association now having a very different position. Have I done for 10 minutes? Sorry.
Yeah, it's all right.
I'm going to have to go on for a bit longer.
That's fine. Go for it.
So, and I think that also, I just want to say one other thing. In 1956, when Sir Anthony Eden was out to invade the Suez, we were all on a demonstration up and down Whitehall, and at the end of the road there was a big water cannon which was looked after by the firefighters, and they were ready to use this water cannon against us. Can you really imagine firefighters today doing that to a demonstration? We have to understand the gains that have been made and the strengths that we have. And the last thing that the International Working Men's Association, the inaugural address, said was it calls for workers of all countries to unite. And often that's just repeated as a slogan, workers of the world unite, we all know that. But the issue is that we don't all know that it isn't just a foregone conclusion. And it has been attacked on all sides by a number of those who have forced the working class back. There are those who look around themselves and see so-called well-heeled middle-class people and wonder whether there is a working class today. And they see millions employed in public services. Some people tell me that those who work in public services aren't really workers because are they making a profit for somebody? Well, yes, they are. And secondly, those public services are worked in by those who came as a result of the development of the welfare state, and it's because of the attacks on the welfare state that they are now being made redundant and being thrown out of work. So we have to understand that situation. Public services have been forced on the capitalist state through struggle, and also because at certain points they understood that education and health benefited them if workers were healthy and educated. The banking and loans crisis, the loss of homes, jobs and services in the West is changing the status and outlook of this so-called middle class anyway. And it's always necessary to go further than simply looking around ourselves. Because if you look at Africa, the huge companies, the huge factories that we had in Liverpool and other places where thousands of people went to produce cars, they're still doing that. They're doing it in Africa and other places. There are still thousands of workers in these big factories, even if they're not in Britain or necessarily in France and other countries. So we have to see this internationalism, and I think that the Communist International is needed now more than ever. Imperialist expansion since 1848 and the development of finance capital, again which was discussed in a previous session, means huge exploitation, food shortages, the destruction of environment and war. So I think that basically we have to see how is it that that has happened, and I've just one-liner if you like, because I know he's breathing down my neck. The working class has suffered from big betrayals, particularly social democratic nationalism of the First World War, which set the international back enormously, and then the Stalinist bureaucracy, which of course both of which are another session. But I think the continuing sectarian and opportunist leadership, and we have to see our so-called the left as part of that destruction, and we now have to overcome it, has been the problem for the working class. Chris Banbury referred to the poor state of organisation, and I think it's very important that we do have discussion about this with workers themselves, the anti-trade union laws. How the hell aren't they pushed back? Casualisation and low pay. So I think that we as Marxists, or those of us who are Marxists, we're called upon to answer the same question that was posed in the Communist Manifesto. In what relation do communists stand to the workers as a whole? And the response in the manifesto is the communists do not form a separate party opposed to other working class parties. They have no interests separate and apart from those of the workers as a whole. They do not set up any sectarian principles of their own by which to shape and mould the workers' movement. And I think that means now uniting the Marxists to refound the Communist International. And those who are not Marxists shouldn't be frightened by that. Just look at the Communist International and you'll find it isn't anything to be frightened of. It is for everybody a way forward. And finding ways to join all workers in struggle. And at this point, London Underground workers, the workers in North Africa, the workers in Wisconsin, and we have to build the workers' movement. That's our responsibility, and it is an urgent task. So I hope that today will point us in that direction and lead to a unity that we can forge today, and so go forward on that basis.
Right, thanks for that, Dot. Sorry about keeping it tight. Okay, next up we've got Pete Ramand from the International Socialist Group in Scotland, newly formed organisation of socialists. So yeah, go ahead.
It's clear that we live in a world system in crisis. But that crisis is also beginning to produce serious resistance. Across Europe, we've already seen a series of general strikes. Further afield, we've seen now lorry drivers in Shanghai taking strike action. Of course, we've seen the Arab revolutions as well. And in Britain, at the end of last year, we saw a student movement develop which put pay to the idea that somehow militant resistance was something purely reserved for our European brothers and sisters. And of course that then fed into the magnificent TUC demonstration just over a little more than a month ago, which I think which has already been discussed in previous sessions, but I think it was one of the most significant trade union demonstrations we've seen in this country. And in Glasgow, after that demonstration, we had a Right to Work campaign meeting. It was an excellent meeting which drew together many of the elements that were involved in that demonstration. And one of the speakers at that meeting was Dave Moxham. Now, Dave is the Deputy General Secretary of the STUC, and at the meeting he outlined a three-point plan, if you like, as to how he thought the left should fight the cuts. And I want to go through it because I think it's actually a very good indicator of where large sections of the trade union bureaucracy are thinking. I'm going to come back to these 3 points. But the first point he made was that we had the vote, and by that he meant that we could vote Labour against the Tories and that sort of thing. And in relation to what happened in Scotland just a couple of days ago, I actually want to address this question. Because it was widely accepted on the left and by the Labour Party that this was quite frankly going to be a cakewalk for the Labour Party. It was going to be easy. The polls conducted, for example, by the Herald only in February suggested that the Labour Party were going to walk it easily. They had a massive lead in the polls and that sort of thing. But actually what happened was the SNP absolutely demolished the Labour Party. Not only did they win the election, not only did they gain an overall majority, which is quite frankly unheard of under that electoral system, but they actually broke in to Labour heartlands, safe Labour seats in Lanarkshire, in Glasgow, and places like that. Right? And I think what this, the first thing to say about this actually, is that I don't think this was a reactionary vote. Actually, it was clear that the message of the Labour Party in the elections just did not cut it with working class voters. Because what the Labour Party said was, vote us against the Tories, but we're still going to implement cuts. Just not quite as many cuts, not quite as fast, but essentially Labour cuts are still better than Tory cuts. And this was quite clearly rejected by the voters. And quite frankly, when you look at, say for example, the position of someone like Ed Miliband. Now, Ed Miliband is clearly saying that the Labour Party needs to break from New Labour, but at the same time, he's trying to disassociate himself from any trade union supporters he has or anything like that. The result is this. There is no alternative vision put forward by the Labour Party in any way. And the SNP played a very clever game, because rhetorically, they were able to outflank the Labour Party from the left. They were able to articulate that they were against the war, against Trident nuclear weapons, that they opposed tuition fees, they'd abolished the graduate endowment tax, they brought in free school meals for kids, and that sort of thing. At the same time, they got this populism down to a T, because at the same time as rhetorically outflanking the Labour Party from the left, they were clearly on the side of big business and finance capital. I mean, you don't get Rupert Murdoch and the Sun coming out in favour of Alex Salmond unless they think that the SNP is going to back the interest of big business. Now, I think what this means though, and I think what it shows, is an acceleration of the crisis of reformism. If you've got a position where the Labour Party are losing seats like Shettleston in Glasgow, like Cathcart, very, Labour strongholds. Nobody thought that the Labour Party would ever lose in these seats. Actually, I think what you're seeing is a crisis of reformism on a very serious level. And what does that actually mean for us, though? Because there are Labour Party voters voting SNP, but these aren't hardcore Scottish nationalists or anything like that. Actually, what it means, the break from reformism, means that large sections of the working class can then, in the future, be won to more militant action against the cuts. Now, I'm just going to return to the other points that Dave Moxham made in that meeting, because the second point he made was that we needed another big mass trade union organised demonstration in Scotland in the summer. And this is something that I wholeheartedly welcome, and I think it is the role of every socialist to make sure that this is the biggest possible demonstration that Scotland has seen. The third point he made was about the need for coordinated strike action. And we're going to see the start of this possibility on the 30th of June, where some of the smaller unions will take action. And of course this has to be welcomed, and I think that the reason for this is because workers have taken confidence from the TUC demonstration. They'll be further given more confidence by a big demonstration in Scotland. But I think we also have to say that it needs to go beyond just the small unions. We need to be able to find ways to draw Unison, Unite and the other big unions into strike action if we're actually seriously going to talk about defeating these cuts and defeating this government. I think we also have to look at other sections of the working class, unorganised sections of the working class. As Chris referred to earlier, the precarious sections. Now in Glasgow, the single biggest employer are call centres. And there's a thing going around at the moment in Glasgow, by the way, where in call centres, managers are telling their workers, you've got to wear nappies to avoid them going for toilet breaks. Quite frankly, it is disgusting. Now, these are groups of workers that we need to be organised, and that's why members of the International Socialist Group have been central to initiatives. For example, the Shop Worker Bulletin, which aims to organise workers in supermarkets. We've been central to establishing the new Unite Bar and Hospitality Workers branch, which is organising those workers. And one of our comrades, Brian Simpson, who incidentally is being charged for taking part in the Millbank protests, is also a call centre worker and a shop steward. He initiated a bulletin in his workplace. He managed to unionise a successful unofficial strike in the call centre. And I think these are things that we need to generalise right now. And one of the reasons for that is that if you look at, for example, the makeup of these workplaces, for a start, there's a lot of students who work there part-time. Can we begin to take the vibrancy of the student demonstrations, because many of those workers were involved in the student demonstrations against cuts at university, and can we take that spirit of resistance and bring it into the workplace as well? But I think it's also clear that right now we do need revolutionary socialist organisation. And that's why in Scotland we've initiated the International Socialist Group. And in only a few weeks we have managed to, we've got now 50 members in Glasgow, with members joining in Edinburgh and Dundee as well now. On Wednesday we're going to launch our website, and the start of next month we'll see the launch of a new monthly magazine that we're going to produce. But I think it's also clear that the real test of any socialist group is its ability to work with and influence much wider forces within the working class and within society. And I think it's here that in some levels there's a degree of theoretical confusion. And so, for example, I want to bring up one argument that was made to me. And, for example, Alice Klinikos of the SWP has for a while now been making an argument that you can't have a united front around the effects of the recession. Essentially, that on economic questions, you can't get around the trade union bureaucracy like that. Now, first of all, I mean, if you look at the way the United Front was classically formulated in relation to 1920s Germany, where the KPD approached the SPD in relation to unity against the capitalist offensive, that wasn't about trying to get round the trade union bureaucracy. Actually, that's not what the United Front is about at all. That's quite honestly closer to a popular front, which is essentially an alliance with reformists where the politics is dictated by the reformists. Rather, utilising the United Front tactic, we're attempting to both work with and against the trade union bureaucracy and the reformist leadership. Because essentially, joint action with a trade union bureaucracy, with reformist leaders and so on, allows us to obviously then conduct an argument not only with them, with the forces they bring into the room, and it then allows you to expose the trade union bureaucracy as well as that, working with and against. So we need to pull them into joint action with us. And I think we also have to recognise that there is a weakness, a severe weakness of rank and file organisation in this country, which makes the United Front even more vital. And the reason I brought up, for example, Dave Moxham and the comments made before, is because out with point one, actually there's serious possibility of joint action with sections of the trade union bureaucracy, with reformist leaders, and so on. And there's one final point I want to make, which I don't think we can fall into the trap of economism, purely focusing on the trade unions, putting motions through trade union branches, and that sort of thing. We have to look to every section of the working class that is being affected by the cuts. That means we need to work not only with trade unionists and workers, we need to draw students into action. We need to work with pensioners. We need to work with the unemployed, with people who are affected by the closure of their hospital or their community centre. We need the maximum possible unity against the austerity measures of this government. And I think that the coalition of resistance is the best example of moving towards that so far. And I think that if we build a movement on that basis, that does have maximum unity, that does draw the majority and a mass of workers into action, then not only will it be possible to stop the cuts, not only will it be possible to bring down the government, but it's under these conditions that the radical left can grow, and the radical left can grow rapidly.
Right, thank you, Pete. Our next speaker is Neil Faulkner, historian, socialist, an author, and also a member of the COUNTERFORUM editorial board. So yeah, Neil.
And I'm going to prop this door open in the hope that we get a little bit of draft. It's hot now. I'm going to start by making a very simple point, which is about it's about the centrality of the working class, because we are not going to stop the cuts by voting for slightly slower cuts under Labour. We're not going to stop the cuts by just waiting for the TUC or the trade union leaders to call action. We're not going to stop the cuts by having just demos, even quite big demos. We're not going to do it simply by organising a series of direct action events in different places, useful though those activities may be. Only by mobilising the force of the British working class are we going to be able to stop the Condemn programme of austerity and privatisation. And I'm going to make this point very, very simply. That is because the working class is the overwhelming majority. And when I talk about the working class, I don't just mean the trade unions. It's the overwhelming majority. It's the 80% of the population who produce the goods and the services and who depend on wages, both the wages that they're paid as individuals or their families are, and the social wage. That 80% of the population has to be mobilised, and it's the great majority. It's about the working class, because when we talk about the working class, we're thinking about ordinary people in their capacity as producers. Truth is, we don't have much power as voters. We all know that, because it doesn't make a great deal of difference who we vote for. They still do whatever they like. We don't have a huge amount of power as consumers, as citizens. The power of working people is in the workplaces, and that is because that's where the goods and the services that constitute the wealth of society are created. That's where the real power of our side lies. But the third thing about the working class is this. The working class, broadly defined, the 80% who do not benefit from the cuts, who do not benefit from privatisation, that class does not have any interest in the cuts, in the privatisation, in the destruction of the welfare state, indeed in the system, unlike the people represented by the Condemn coalition. There are no shortcuts in this struggle. The stakes are very high. It's going to last for a long time. It's going to be hard fought. There are no shortcuts. If we do not build a mass movement of the overwhelming majority, which means a mass movement of the working class, they will destroy the welfare state. Now that's the first simple point I want to make. We have to, as revolutionaries, as socialists, as anti-cuts activists, face up to the central task of building a mass movement of working people. They are not just concerned with ideology. I mean, I think James did a very good meeting and made it very, very clear that central to their project is not just an ideological program of attacking our side, attacking the welfare state, of privatisation because they think that that's the right thing to do. It's about defending the city. It's about defending finance capital. It's about refunding the state so that the state can do further bailouts. It's also to do with this. British capitalism is in long-term decline, and now we can say Western capitalism as a whole is in decline. And when Cameron talks about the transformation of Britain, he's talking about shifting wealth from workers to the rich, from labour to capital, from us to them, in order to make British capitalism more competitive as it declines relative to rising capitalisms elsewhere, in order to involve us all in a race to the bottom, so that the sections of the world working class that set the standards are workers in China and workers in India and workers in Thailand, and we're all pulled down to that level instead of the new sections of the working class in newly developing economies being pulled up to our level. That's what it's about, whether we're involved in that kind of race to the bottom. Now, that being so, you have to ask the question, I mean, if the stakes are so high, if that's really what it's about, why is it that workers are not fighting? Why are the unions not taking action? It's not because workers support the cuts. It's not because they support privatisation. It's not because they support the system. It's absolutely clear there's all sorts of evidence that makes that absolutely apparent. You've only got to look at the election results, actually. What's interesting about the election results was that the people who voted for a party that was left of centre, that then became part of a hard right government, abandoned that party. That's why the Liberal Democrat vote collapsed. The Tory vote didn't collapse because their supporters didn't vote left of centre. Their supporters voted for cuts and privatisation at our expense. The Lib Dem vote collapsed because their voters had been conned into believing that they represented an alternative. The election result shows it. The pensions issue shows it. The pensions issue is absolutely visceral, I think. I mean, workers are absolutely furious that they're being expected to pay more, wait longer, and get less. The management union in teaching, I mean, I'm an ex-teacher. I mean, the idea of the National Association of Head Teachers going on strike is just a kind of mind-blowing if you're an ex-classroom teacher. The NAHT voted at its conference by 99.6% to have a strike ballot on the question of pensions. Now, if that's what the management union in teaching is saying, don't underestimate the way in which this issue could erupt. And I'm going to say something about the coalition of resistance. You see, on the 26th of March, here's another measure of it, a measure of the level of anger that there is, resistance that there is. The coalition, the 26th of March demonstration was a sea of coalition of resistance placards. Now, I'd like to think that it was because of the lollipop design, which I had something to do with in the discussions, but I don't think it was the lollipop. It was the slogan. It was the design, which said no cuts. And it was simple, and it was hard politics, and it meant that the fact that workers were taking those placards in preference to any others, and the fact there was a sea of them, the length and breadth of the demonstration, meant that the whole of that demonstration was to the left of half of the platform. Half the platform, represented by Miliband saying slightly slower cuts, Brendan Barber, the head of the TUC, saying it'll all be sorted out by public opinion. The fact that the demonstration was taking the no cuts placards is an indication that people were to the left of the platform. The anger is there. The problem is that the level of confidence to take action is right down here. There is a huge contradiction between the level of anger in British society and the confidence of workers to take action in the workplaces. Now, there are reasons for this. There are historic reasons for it, and I'll just very, very quickly list them. for the, largely really, I mean, older activists know the problems, but largely for the benefit of the younger activists in the room. Union membership has fallen dramatically in the last 25 to 30 years. I mean, there were 12 million trade union members at the end of the 1970s. Now there are about 6.5. The level of unionisation in the public sector is still quite good, at about 50%. In the private sector, it's 15%. Only 15% of workers in the private sector are actually in trade unions. There's a legacy of defeat and retreat. There's a very, very low level of strikes at the moment. Lots and lots of workers aren't in unions at all. Lots of workers have no experience of strike action. There's a complete decay of any real rank and file organisation where workers are organised in the workplaces to such a degree they've actually got the confidence to take action themselves without waiting for the authority of their trade union leaders. So the result is that industrial action, generally speaking at the moment, it's bureaucratically controlled completely from above, it's legally fettered, and it takes a rather ritualistic form of a series of token strikes over a long period, and eventually it fizzles out without a clear result. At some point, if we are going to stop the cuts and the privatisation, at some point, the mass of ordinary workers have to break through. They have to break through the bureaucratic barriers, they have to break through the legal barriers, and they have to begin to take large-scale industrial action, all-out industrial action, if necessary, driven by unofficial revolt from below, by wildcat action. That's how all of the big explosions of class struggle after a long period of downturn have unfolded in the past. The key task for revolutionaries, therefore, in relation to the working class is how we raise the level of confidence of workers to take action so that it begins to move to the level of anger. We have to mediate that contradiction between the level of anger and the lack of confidence that there is inside the workplaces to take action. Now, this is why the coalition of resistance is absolutely central. Because what it says is this: we make no compromise on the question of cuts, on the question of privatisation, on the question of their arguments about the need for us to pay for the bankers' crisis. The politics are absolutely clear-cut. No cuts, and we are in favour of investment. We're in favour of growth. We're in favour of creating jobs. We're in favour of a society that's put to work to create the wealth, to provide the goods and the services that people need. At the same time, and this is the second element, that's why it connected so well on the 26th of March. The second point is this: we say it can't be done by just one union. It's got to be all the unions. But it can't be done by just the unions. The unions have got to link with other campaigns, with the community, with the students, with the pensioners, with the claimants. In other words, we have to build a mass movement which unites everybody who wants to fight the cuts into a single movement in order to create a framework of political activity which begins to create the confidence that you need to take on the boss in your own workplace. The left, for about 10 years, has been strong on the streets, strong in the politics of street protest. We have to take the politics of street protest. We have to use the politics of street protest to reinvigorate the workplaces and raise the level of combativity inside the workplaces so that workers rediscover the confidence to begin to break through and to begin to take industrial action on the scale which is going to be necessary. Let me just cap that point finally in order to emphasise it. There is a contradiction between the level of anger which is right up here and the level of action which is down here. What's crucial to dealing with that contradiction is using the politics of the street to raise the level of combativity inside the workplaces. The coalition of resistance is about doing that, and that is the way in which revolutionary socialists need to operate in relation to the working class in the period ahead, in order to help to create an explosion of working class revolt from below that can sweep away the condemned coalition of millionaires.